Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Manuela Hansen and I am the managing editor and assistant to the curator of the exhibition. This is our last event for this series of meetings on arts for the Biennale Arte 2022. I want to start thanking Cecilia Alemani, curator of the Milk of Dreams, who has enabled this week's platform for discussions, conversations, and encounters between extraordinary artists, scholars, curators, writers, and thinkers to further expand and reflect upon concerns connected to the show. It has been an honor to work alongside Cecilia and my colleague Marta Papini on this exhibition and the catalog and meetings on arts. I want to thank especially to all the speakers who have come to Venice or connected through Zoom. The conversations and presentations have been so enriching and inspiring, and we are very grateful for your participation. For all of you who could not come to Venice or see the panels live, they will remain available at the website and channels of La Biennale di Venezia. Thank you also to the audience for coming to our last and exciting panel, and to the Biennale team who has made the organization possible. In particular, John Brandmeier, Marina Bertaglia, Ilaria Zanella, Raffaele Cinotti, and Francesca Montorio. It is a pleasure to introduce the 11th and final event around feminist approaches to curating, featuring curator and professor Andrea Giunta, curator and historian Adrien Zina, professor Clarissa Ricci, and novelist, screenwriter, critic, and editor Jennifer Higgy. Today's panel will discuss curatorial practice from a feminist standpoint, traveling or going beyond the idea of curating all women's shows. Now a few words on how the event will go. Jennifer Higgy will open with an introduction, and Andrea Giunta will then present a short keynote from Zoom. And each speaker will then do a short presentation followed by a conversation moderated by Jennifer. They will open to questions towards the end of the discussion at around 6:45 p.m., so please hold them. Before leaving the stage, a few words of introduction to Jennifer Higgy, who will then introduce our guest speakers. Jennifer Higgy is an Australian writer who lives in London. She's the author of the novel Bedlam, the editor of The Artist's Joke, the author and illustrator of the children's book There's Not One. Her new book, published in 2021, is titled The Mirror and the Palette, Rebellion, Revolution, and Resilience, 500 Years of Women's Self-Portraits. She's currently working on a book about women surrealists, about women artists and the spirit world. We are delighted also that Jennifer has contributed to our catalog with a critical essay engaging with the historical capsule in the exhibition titled Corp of Beat that is in the Central Pavilion. In her piece, Higgy engages with a diverse group of 19th century and 20th century female artists and writers from different geographies, from spiritualists and medium artists, futurists, surrealists, to 1960s and 70s women in concrete poetry, who used their bodies and made art to liberate words and themselves from a language and world governed by patriarchal laws and mores. The capsule examined by Higgy, Corp of Beat, is in part inspired by Materializzazione del Linguaggio, an exhibition that the artist Mirella Bentivoglio curated for the Biennale Arte 1978. Featuring visual and concrete poetry, Materializzazione was one of the first exhibitions in the Biennale's history dedicated to women artists. In response to this homage, La Biennale di Venezia has reprinted the legendary exhibition catalog of this exhibition, which you can see here. And you can also buy at the bookshop here at the Arsenale and the Central Pavilion and online. So we hope also that our panelists today will take up and discuss this historical show. I would like to thank Mirella Bentivoglio's family and the archive they constituted after her passing. They are working on a new exhibition opening next autumn. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jennifer Higgy.
Oops, just open this up. Thank you very much, Manuela, and thank you very much to the Venice Biennale for this generous invitation. It's so exciting to be here and to be talking with these wonderful panelists. Okay, here's my introduction. We're here today to discuss the need or not for all women exhibitions. It's a complicated question. On the one hand, I hear people say, isn't that a little old hat? Women in the West now have more power and political agency than at any time in history. Female artists are everywhere, and what constitutes gender is complex. Numerous museums across the globe are prioritizing exhibitions and acquisitions of work by women artists. Gender equity plans are being rolled out, and art history is being rewritten as a more inclusive story. And yet, the World Economic Forum has announced that the global gender gap is not expected to close for 136 years. And going by recent statistics on gender and exhibitions published by various organizations such as the Freelands Foundation in London and the Countess and Sheila reports in Australia, the art world is not much better. Despite the fact that far more women graduate from art schools, commercial galleries still represent far more men than women, and a recent survey of the permanent collections of 18 major art museums in the United States revealed that out of more than 10,000 artists, 87% were male and 85% were white. The art market isn't much better. A couple of years ago, an article in ArtNet reported that from 2009 until 2019, the combined global sales of work by around 6,000 female artists added up to less than the total sales of work by Pablo Picasso during the same period. Some more examples. As recently as 2018, I visited an exhibition at the Palazzo Strozzi in Florence. Titled Dawn of a Nation, it explored the intertwining of art and politics from the 1950s to the late 60s in Italy. It included more than 80 works of art, and yet only one was by a female artist, Giuseppe Fioroni. In 2019, the Prado in Madrid dedicated an exhibition to two great women artists of the Renaissance, Sofonisba Anguissola and Lavinia Fontana. But it was only the second time the museum had staged an exhibition devoted to women in 200 years. In 2020, the National Gallery in London staged its first solo exhibition of a female artist, Artemisia Gentileschi. There are only 24 paintings by women in the National Gallery's collection out of more than 2,300 works. These are just a few examples. The list is endless because art is part of the world, and the world is still far from equal. The historical precedents for the cultural amnesia of art history are, of course, complex. The overarching one, however, is straightforward. Traditional art history reflects the narrative of a white heteronormative patriarchy that has traditionally valued the achievements of white men over women, trans, queer, or gender non-conforming people, or people of color. There are, of course, many other exclusions too, especially around class and ableism, but they're not our focus today. It's so easy now, as a woman in the 21st century liberal society, to take our access to education, politics, choice for granted. But for centuries, and still in many countries across the globe, today, women faced or face countless barriers if they wanted or want to live a creative life. They were and are expected to be wives, mothers, or nuns, not artists. In the Renaissance, women were excluded from apprenticeships, discouraged from joining guilds and societies, and forbidden to work on scaffolds, apart from rare exceptions, such as the school opened for women by the brilliant Bolognese artist Elisabetta Serrani in the 17th century. Public art schools for female students didn't come into existence in some countries until at least the late 19th century. In Germany, it wasn't until 1919. But a lack of access wasn't the only thing stopping women from pursuing a career as a painter or a sculptor. Artists need the financial and critical support of collectors, curators, and art historians to survive. Without a solid community, it's difficult to forge a career. Given what they're up against, it's astonishing that so many women persisted, and against all odds, how many of them achieved greatness. In 15th and 16th century Italy, at least 120 women were working as professional artists, despite the restrictions they faced, and yet much of what they created is either lost or we can assume misattributed. Giorgio Vasari mentions 13 women in the second edition of his Lives of the Artists in 1568, including Sofonisba Anguissola, who was the most prolific self-portraitist between Dürer and Rembrandt. The Venetian writer and artist Irene di Cipilimbergo, who was considered so gifted that when she died at only 19, in 1559 was praised by 140 poets, and yet nothing she created has survived. Likewise, no works by her contemporary Lucrezia Quistelli definitively exist. Artemisia Gentileschi was one of the great artists of the Baroque, yet has only recently been given her place in the Pantheon. North of Italy, one of the most prolific portraitists in the 17th century was the Dutch painter Judith Leyster, the only woman amongst 30 men to be accepted as a member of the Haarlem Guild of St. Luke. Soon after she died in 1660, she was seemingly forgotten until the late 19th century, when most of her paintings were credited to either her rival Frans Hals or her husband Jan Mincer-Molenaar. In France, the prodigy Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun became Marie Antoinette's favorite artist, and at her death in 1842, she left behind 600 or so paintings. And yet she had her first retrospective in France in 2015. And these are just a few of the examples. I could go on for hours. In their groundbreaking book of 1981, Old Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology, the art historians Rosika Parker and Griselda Pollock observed that something strange happened in the 20th century, that a focus on the achievements of women artists dwindled just when women were beginning to practice art in far greater numbers than ever before. For example, although they have now been updated in the first editions of the most popular art historical textbooks of the 20th century, E.H. Gombrich's Story of Art, 1950, and H.W. Jansen's History of Art, 1962, the only women mentioned are those painted by men. The possibility that a woman too could be a creator, as opposed to a subject, didn't seem to occur to them. Gombrich's book alone has sold around 7 million copies, and Jansen's over 4 million. When I was at art school, I studied both of these books. In Kenneth Clark's best-selling The Nude, A Study in Ideal Form, which covers art from ancient Greece to the late 1930s, not a single woman artist is mentioned. In the index, mention of woman is listed as condemnation of, crouching, old, nudes, prehistoric, statues of, virgin. It took a few decades for feminist art historians to rebut these glaring distortions. In particular, in 1971, Linda Nochlund's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? In 1979, Germaine Greer's The Obstacle Race, The Fortune of Women Painters and Their Work. And in 1981, as mentioned, Pollock and Parker's Old Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology. But artists too rebelled. Countless exhibitions and protests were organized around the globe. Here in Venice, incensed by the ongoing omission of women from the narrative, in 1978, the Italian artist, writer, and curator Mirella Bentivoglio curated the exhibition Materialization of Language for the 38th Venice Biennale, the first exhibition in the Biennale's history dedicated to women artists. However, although the Biennale opened in July, Bentivoglio's exhibition was launched in September. She'd been hastily invited to put together a show in response to widespread feminist protests at the lack of women in the main exhibition. The result was a coming together of 81 contemporary and historical female poets and artists. Although they worked across a range of media, all of these artists sought, in Bentivoglio's words, to reactivate the atrophied tools of communication that had been imposed upon them by patriarchal power structures. Clarissa Ritchie, one of our speakers today, will be talking more about Bentivoglio and her important show. That women are increasingly being given solo exhibitions and their work is finally being acquired by museums and highlighted in recent exhibitions such as Fantastic Women at the Schöne Kunsthalle Frankfurt, Women in Change at Aachen in Denmark, Know My Name, Australian Women Artists 1900 to Now at the National Gallery Australia, Radical Women, Latin American Art 1960 to 1985 at the Hammer Museum, Brooklyn Museum in Pinacoteca de São Paulo, and Women in Abstraction at the Pompidou and Guggenheim Bilbao is heartening. But there's still a long way to go. Cecilia Alemani's brilliant Milk of Dreams is perhaps a new paradigm. While it includes a large majority of women, queer, trans, and non-binary artists, it isn't framed around gender, but rather the interlinking of ideas and sensibility, the radical reinvention of the human and the self, in Alemani's words. I look forward to the day that initiatives such as 5 Women Artists, which was orchestrated in 2016 by the National Museum of Women in the Arts in the US, in response to the fact that most people polled couldn't name-check one female artist, aren't necessary. But change will only come about if women artists and everyone else has been excluded from the narrative are given greater visibility. Deeply entrenched biases take generations to redress. To my mind, it's essential that a very bright light continues to be cast on the dark spaces of discrimination that continue to flourish. The sheer variety and volume of paintings and sculptures by women that have been erased from history is staggering, and quite simply, it's no longer acceptable. neither is it acceptable to assume that the term woman is a simple one. No two women are alike, and it's time that their multiplicity is acknowledged. So what to do? The question we're discussing today is it still viable and necessary to stage exhibitions devoted to the achievements of women artists? And if so, are they exercises in consciousness raising, a correction to historical inaccuracies, or simply another form of reduction or ghettoization of othering women? And more broadly, what is the role of museums in acknowledging the exclusions that have for so long shaped their collections? I'd like now to introduce the distinguished speakers who will be exploring these questions and more from various perspectives. First up, we have a keynote by Andrea Junta, an Argentine writer, curator, and professor at Buenos Aires University, co-curator of Radical Women, Latin American Art 1960 to 85, and chief curator of Mercosur Biennale 12, Feminines, Visualities, Actions, and Effects. Her recent books include Rethinking Everything and the forthcoming The Political Body, Stories on Art, Feminism, and Emancipation in Latin America. She will be followed by a paper by the architect, artist, curator, dance, and performance art historian, Adrienne Sina, whose recent work includes the book and exhibition Feminine Futures 2, Expression, Abstraction, the Membrane of Dreams, which was created in conjunction with Elles font l'abstraction at the Centre Pompidou and Women in Abstraction at the Guggenheim Bilbao. And he will be followed by Clarissa Ricci, adjunct professor at the University of Bologna, whose research focuses on the history and networks of exhibitions, biennales, fairs, and museums. She is the founder and editor of Oboe Journal on biennales and other exhibitions, and her latest book, Aperto 1980 to 1993, addresses the Aperto exhibition series for young artists at the Venice Biennale. Thanks very much. I'm very much looking forward to hearing these papers.
Thank you very much for the invitation to present a paper at the 59 Venice Biennale Conference. Thank you to Cecilia Alemani and to Manuela Hansen. In order to make more clear my presentation, I will do it with the PowerPoint. The proposal of my paper is to offer a kind of answer to the question. The title that is in the title. The title is Exhibitions of Women Artists, Objectives or Strategies. And then I will begin with an exhibition that is very well known now, but in which we began to work in 2010 when Cecilia Fajardo Gil invited me to co-curate Latin American artists between 1960-1985 exhibition. We wanted to address what their specific contribution had been and why, having been outstanding artists in their respective countries, they had been erased from the history of national and Latin American art. We focused on the period that corresponded with the second wave of feminism. We conceived this exhibition as the first historical exhibition that we wanted at the beginning continued in a second part from the 80s to the present. Radical women wanted to deal with definitions, keywords, context, to trace a history of this period in a myriad of Latin American countries. We got a lot of criticism for not including men, and this was surprising. It was easy for us to add 10% men, but we decided to maintain our purpose to map women artists during this period of time in Latin America. Since then, both Cecilia and I have developed projects in which we work with the concept of feminine from non-essentialist and non-biological perspectives. Personally, in the projects I curated since Radical Women, like the Biennale 12 in Porto Alegre, rethinking everything that it was installed at the Les Rencontres de la Photographie in Arles, or when the world changes in a cultural center, Kirchner Cultural Center in Buenos Aires. In all these exhibitions, I comprise a diverse agenda, much broader than the struggle for the recognition of artists that was our departing point at the beginning of Radical Women Project. I understood feminism as a way of reconceptualizing the world, especially considering issues like the relationship between humans and nature, the extenuation of the planet, together with the struggles, for example, of Argentine women for human rights, against racism, exoticism, and violence against women. These agendas are represented by female artists and male artists from artists of different identities. I differentiate women and feminist agendas. There has been an immense production of exhibitions by women artists. We could mention a long genealogy. I display some covers of exhibition catalogs, since ELS to Global Feminisms, WAC. In fact, I am collaborating now with the exhibition organized by the Kunstmuseum Wolfsburg in Germany, and with projects such as the one carried out by Aware Archives here in the angle, you can see. And for example, also Katie Deepwell in England with a compilation of 50 feminist art manifestos. We did the exhibition Radical Women considering the low representation of women artists in Latin America. Here is a figure we elaborated in a seminar I was teaching in 2010 at the University of Texas in Austin. And these numbers in Latin America are not different of those of central institutions of art, very well mapped by Maura O'Reilly, in an article published in 2015 in Art News. I am showing here the figure that concerns Venice Biennale, where she mapped the female presence. My conclusion about Radical Women is the following. This exhibition allowed us to clearly visualize that these artists had to contribute with their works to a differentiated vision of the body, particularly the female body. That body that had been observed from an external point of view, as very well pointed out Laura Mulvey, in her chapter, Conceptualizing the Representation of Women in Hollywood Cinema. These artists elaborated a periscopic vision that approached the body almost from an internal eye, with angles and frames that were not previously found. If you look here, the works are completely, fractioning the body and affording concepts, textures, feelings, temperatures. And also, these artists were very much connected with psychoanalysis, both Freudian and Lacanian, with sociology, with the discourses of medicine, subverting point of view based on scientific perspectives. They developed sophisticated resources around language and the body. They proposed ways of viewing the violence of Latin American dictatorships from very specific perspectives. Let us not to forget that many artists, and these are photos of artists that were in prison, all of them from Uruguay, and also that it were developed precise procedures directed to the body and the subjectivity of women, like rape, pregnancies, cesareans without anesthesia, stolen children. Women were murdered, even thrown alive into the River Plate in Argentina. Her works account for non-essentialized visions of motherhood in which they create a parodic and critical distance opposed to the one that standardizes social discourses. Many of these artists especially observed the indigenous presence in Latin America, and I'm thinking in Claudia Andújar or in Cecilia Vicuña, also the Black presence, and also reflecting poetically on natural resources, on the relationship with nature. They did it through an experimental, inventive, and novel language. Passerasuris from Chile, deframing sexualities, Ana Mendieta affording non-essential perspectives about femininity, the construction of the reproductive system of women through everyday devices, performances calling attention toward violence in Colombia, or these photos that has to do with processes of sterilization of women, Latino women in LA health system in the 70s. Many of these works were ignored, hidden, and erased. Curators specialized in Latin America confess to knowing 30% of the artists on the exhibition. Since then, their works have been integrated into museums, collections, private collections, public ones, and entered in galleries. Was it important to make an exhibition like Radical Women? Yes, definitely. This is my answer. Today in Latin America, there is much care regarding parity and the representation of female artists in all art circuits, and great care to observe the Afro-Latin American and indigenous artistic dynamics to incorporate their works in collections, exhibitions, and awards. There have been changes, and we are still in the process of change. And without a doubt, it was excellent that the Radical Women exhibition was inaugurated in 2017, when in the face of Trump's misogynist speech that came to Washington, the exhibition also had a political role, along with the Great Women's March, the largest in the history of all demonstrations in the United States, in coincidence with the Me Too reaction or movement. We are in a moment of violent effervescence of anti-feminism, linked to the fascist discourses of the right that are multiplying in the world. We are in a moment of paradigm shift, and no change occurs without resistance. In relation to the exclusion of female artists from the long history of art, exhibitions of female artists were never a goal. The purpose is through them to transform curatorial practices, historiography, public and private collections. Curating women exhibitions is just one of the many strategies to give them visibility. It is a strategy, not a goal. Unlike any strategy, it is articulated based on what you want to transform in diverse moments. Do women artists have the representation that corresponds to the scope, poetic, and conceptual sophistication that they have achieved in the long history of art? No, not yet. We can work with statistics, market, books, and we will see clearly how much work is still necessary to do. In this context, an exhibition like the one curated by Cecilia Alemani for the Venice Biennale is absolutely necessary. In addition to the fact that it has not been exclusive, since it incorporates male artists together with diversities whose exclusion was based on race, class, and geopolitical reasons that led out of the canon, the art of countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the art of Afro-descendant artists, indigenous artists. In addition of that, it is a biennial that starts from an exquisite concept. If you have the opportunity to read the stories and see the drawings by Leonora Carrington in The Milk of Dream, you will have been able to appreciate the richness of the body crossing and the conceptual lapse that the artist produced in that little book. The Biennale is a poetic constellation that proposes the opposite of what results from the pandemic and the absurdity of a new war. Does this biennial change the patriarchal order that still exists in the art world? No. It is a strategy that looks forward to this transformation. It is not about showing women artists. It is about addressing human blindness regarding their place in the world, about giving relevance to the work carried out by the immense Afro-descendant culture in the world, or to the indigenous presence that bears an emancipatory and decolonial discourse. Corporations continue to cut down the jungle inhabited by indigenous Yanomami communities, or Quam in the impenetrable forest in Chaco, privatizing lakes and territories that belong to the Mapuche community, polluting their territories through open pit mining, or destroying marine fauna with trucking to extract gas and oil. We know that an exhibition does not change the world, but it proposes a forceful scenario in which it is possible to emphasize the urgency. In 1978, an exhibition was held at the Venice Biennale represented only by female artists who worked with language. The exhibition explored their contributions to concrete poetry, a form of expression that, at least in Latin America, is still narrated and studied from a patriarchal perspective. More than 40 years later, we need to continue making exhibitions that give visibility to the contributions of women artists. We need to do it not only as an act of justice towards them and their works, but also because eliminating their contributions, censoring their works, avoiding them to be known, implies a reduction in the right of viewers, of audiences, to access the right they have to access diverse, complex concepts and representations of the world. The repetition of new artists, of few artist names that have a powerful place in the market, reduce the emancipatory potential of art and culture. Although the patriarchal discourses of the war are pronounced by men and women, the war, the occupations, the devastations, the shootings, the carrying the weapons are patriarchal representations. The works presented in this biennial allow us to rethink the state of the world. It is said, I have serious doubts, that we are still on time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. That was an absolutely fascinating paper. Now over to you, Adrian. Thank you.
In fact, I started making cross-disciplinary exhibitions during the mid-90s, and then I imagined that something was missing as the origin of what I was curating. So I went back like a salmon to the river of the origin and found a magnificent scope of women artists of the early 20th century, which were completely forgotten. No artwork was in any collection. In most of the exhibition, for example, for Valentine de Saint-Point, who is part of the Milk of Dreams, she was reduced to 2 lines in the exhibition of futurism in the chronology section. And I started collecting. So now I have something like 4,000 magnificent photography of performance, manuscript, theoretical writings, and I lend to, this is the view of the exhibition, the option on the future publications. The first one was already published in 2011. This is the map of the organization of my loans and my advice to exhibitions, but also contributions to talks, to the catalog, with essays, with theoretical contributions, because everything has to be done, and the history of these avant-gardes of the years 10 to 30s has to be written, and it has been forgotten even by the feminists of the 60s and the 70s. There is a discontinuity between the feminism, which is a real question. These are some loans to different museums. The right one is the forthcoming volume. You can see some items of the, some examples of the artworks here. This was in Dijon, a mega exhibition on 600 square meters with 6,000 works and videos in 2014. Other views. Valentine de Saint-Point here, books, and lots of films. This is the Feminine Futures at the Museum Blindbat in 2015, which is a utopian place full of exceptional impressionist artworks, and I had to cover the stage, the level, the upper levels. And in this little utopian site, many of my dancers in Switzerland were invited to make soirees and performances during the 20s, so it was a perfect conjunction. So you can see here the kind of photos I collected. These are by the photographer Soichi Tsunami, and the choreographer and the performer is Martha Graham. And these photos doesn't exist, most of them doesn't exist in any collection, so I'm the only one to have them. This is just for making a connection with the subject of this afternoon that you can recognize. And in my case, I have this magnificent early work of 26 by Milcha Majerova in the scene of the Czech avant-garde dancers. And she performed also the same language with different students and making words with their bodies. These are the loans, for example, of Valentine de Saint-Point to the Milk of Dreams. And I'm absolutely delighted to share with Cecilia Alemani this fascination for radical women and artists of this early 20th century. Valentine de Saint-Point, Enif Angiolini Robert, Giannina Sensi, Mary Wickman. They're both in the mythical dreams and in feminine futures. But in feminine futures, I show a lot around the same artist. I follow each artist from the beginning of her trajectory up to the end. And it's all about the birth of the discipline of performance, which didn't exist, as an artwork, not just as a theater piece, and also the reflection on the feminine psychology of desire, also about the mutation of the civilization, and I never find any equivalent in the male art history. These are Valentine de Saint-Pan dances of war and love, which have some connection with earlier spiritist and esoteric drawings, with all these magnetic fields and rays. She was, during 2 years, part of the futurist movement, and she created this magnificent discipline. You can see that all the other artists who were part of the avant-garde, they are in charge of very classical disciplines such as sculpture and music or painting, and she created for herself. She's the only person to be in the section of the feminine action. And feminine action is the birth of performance, is political action, is everything which is related to the shift of the sociology, the anthropology, the psychology of women, and also her role in the society, which is not limited just to follow the male avant-gardes or the male rule for making avant-gardes. These are her manifestos of the futurist women. Of course, she replied to Marinetti's Scorn for Women, but when you see the real manuscript, the Scorn for Women was extremely minuscule, but it became a kind of exponential volume of typography. These are her a magnificent medal made by Libero Andreotti, who captured her destiny with these three Latin words, superbos, libera, exaltare. And we are with the women I selected in the region of tragedy. And I'm rooting my history of performance in what Aspasia, who was the partner and inspirer of Pericles, who was the first head of democracy in Athens, she initiated the first performance festivals with putting in collaboration philosophers and playwrights such as Anaxagoras and Socrates as a philosopher, and Sophocles and Euripides as playwrights. And these playwrights created these magnificent figures of Antigone, Hecuba, who were figures of resistance and political advanced imagination for ethics and for equity, not between men and women, but between civilization and against the barbarian way of thinking. And Hecuba, for example, is a queen of Troy. She isn't Greek. The Greek people possess civilization, and Euripides questioned this issue, why we who consider ourselves as civilized, we are so barbarian and cruel to Trojan women. So these are many traumas of the history of tragedy that Valentine de Saint-Pan followed, and most of my artists of performance are following. And these are her dances of war, the poppies of blood that she performed both in Paris and in New York, in 1917 in New York, in 1913 in Paris. But she had, because she was an aristocrat and her ancestors were in the realm of knighthood, she had this utopian way of thinking war, but suddenly she understood that war wasn't just about knighthood, but also about blood. And she went to Egypt and founded this anti-colonialist review, which ran from 1927 to 1925 to 27. And started an action with this magnificent text, which is The Truth on Syria in 29, which is a geopolitical picture of the reality of exaction that France committed. You can see all the war crimes that France committed in Syria, while Syria was a mandate given by the United Nations to France to protect civilians. So you have all the hotspots of today, Aleppo, the Jebel Druze, the Great Lebanon Project. These are some of her later poem and disillusion writings, but they are all inscribed to very important people, to the governor of Cairo. Here she made a very important action with flourishing Egypt, dedicated to the Majesty Queen of Egypt in 1914, and she it's like the curatorial work with all the important leaders of feminism in Egypt, including Hoda Sharawi. Here you have a little on the left, Cecilia Alemani exhibiting Eni Fangiolini, this magnificent novel, which is The Womb of a Woman, a surgical novel, is a relationship between the war scene, full of blood and trenches, and her in the hospital, with her womb trenched by the surgeon. So you have this dialogue between the two trenches that she underlined, and it's all about war and body psychology of desire when you're horizontal in a hospital, and these are more political parole in libertà, words in freedom writing. And we come back to the manifesto of dance by Marinetti. He theorized the sound and dances with sounds and movements of war. And she asked Giannina Sensi, when they met in 1917, to make on his poem, which was A 1000 metri su Adrianopoli bombardate, to make a dance of war. And so she made it. And you can see as in the 70s, these are dances with no music, senza musica, and only dance to the poems, and there are war poems everywhere. In the mind of these people, because we are surrounded by war crimes and war scenes everywhere in this period. And Marinetti's Zang Chum Chum in 14, still about Adrianopoli, from which the poem was extracted, destruction, guerra. So you have two different points of view. Marinetti's the war, the only hygiene of the world, but Valentine de Saint-Point published this magnificent book, which is multi-visioned. You have the point of view of the soldiers, point of view of the mothers who will lose their sons. You have the point of view of the poet, the point of view of the philosopher. So it's not just a blind propaganda on war, it's an analysis of war. Mary Wigman, who is exhibited also in the Milk of Dreams. Here you have her dance of traumas and the totem dance of death, and some rehearsal of the Totenmal, who was escaped by on the First World War, and which represent all the wars of the society. You have other struggles, for example, the rebellion of Yomi Hali, who was Jewish and communist and transgender, about her transformation, and she played a lot about the ambiguity of her gender, but in the framework of revolt, revolution, and the travailleurs, the Arbeiter, the workers. this lovely performance, early performance by Julia Marcus, Hitler parody in 1931 and 32, which is a magnificent piece of anticipation and resistance against fascism. Many anti-fascist performance pieces here by Martha Graham, Spectre 1914, performed in 36, and Strike in 29. The immediate tragedy in 37 was about the Spanish Civil War. The Letter to the World on the basis of the Emily Dickinson poem was performed during the war in 1914. The war theme, Magnificent Photo 41, and Heretic, which is the war between Puritanism and conservatism in 29, Lamentation 1913, and you have all this stretch fabric and movements which are following the Lamentation of Martha Graham by Ruth Page, for example, here Mary Billy Montgomery, and magnificent pieces played by Myra Kinch, another American choreographer, during the Berlin Olympic Games. And this photo with a gas mask was published in Vanity Fair, which was the anti-fascist magazine published in America. Anti-war trilogy by Anna Sokolov in America, Pauline Kohner, Anti-War Among the Ruins, which was portraying the plight of Chinese women under Japanese aerial bombardment. Many war dances and movement from here. And this is my section related to the Milk of Dreams, robotic and prosthesis. Here you have the Kaori Ito's prologue Dasobi, which is an erotic, robotic, and hybrid body. Here, Isabel von Grib, more contemporary, 2013, with motion capture and prosthesis, which are applied to the body, extension of the body, in order to create sounds and interact with the composers and create body sounds. Here, her body technology interactive interfaces, questioning transhumanism, which is in question in the Milk of Dreams too. And my surrealist section with Penny Slinger, who was adopted by Max Ernst and Roland Pendrose for her surrealist experiment. These are from '69. Here, a very experimental film she made with a mirror, and you can see that it's almost new technology. Here you have artist replies to war, magnificent piece by Yoko Ono in front of the Vietnam War. You have Zofia Kulik and the Kuyek performance during the 70s in the very closed environment, political and under pressure and oppression of Poland. Here, Tanya Schlander and Rona Jeffman work. Jörn Refman was the filmmaker, and Tanya played Pippi Longstocking, the strongest woman, trying to remove the Ramallah wall between Palestine and Israel. Here, the Chinese artist In Mei Juan, who performed Oppression in 2004. And I created 2 years ago, sorry, a project on war, oppression, and dystopia with artists from Russia and Ukraine and Georgia, Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan, Kostroma, Kiev, Tbilisi. And you have the same strange of artists who are rebel against violence, and this was by Maria Kachalkova. And here by the same dancer included in the dialogue dance with a dissident group in Kostroma, neurasthenia, which is all about, you can imagine, mechanical weakness of the nerves, lassitude, fatigue, anxiety, pain. And this is Alyona Takchenko from Kiev, magnificent dance in 2017, which is a dance of war and at the same time dances grief and sorrow, and at some point they all are vanishing in the water. This is a mega important piece of resistance by Judith de Paul, who is the director of Agency for Artists in Exile in Paris. And this is Zero Risk, doesn't exist. And it was made with a group of performance artists in Nizhny Novgorod with Galina Miznikova, who is the filmmaker. So you can see in the iPads videos that the performers are handling in their hands, and you have wounds, you have, it's all about vanishing people, about oppression and surveillance and horrible closed society in Russia. Elena Kovilina burned a cheese ceremony 2003. And Sean Womack, who is an American choreographer who was in residence in a Kazan city with this group by Neil Ibrigimov, a contemporary dance company Pantera, and they're all in destroyed cities and the destroyed part of the city terrain. And here you have lots of rubble everywhere, and people are interacting. It's 2012. It's not now, but you can see all the reality that we are witnessing right now. And this is my last curatorial project for, it is a project, it's not real, but we will perform it in, at the Pushkin House. It's how to curate war diaries and all the little videos that we witnessed in TikTok following the war in Ukraine. And it was conceived in conversation with the curator Konstantin Akinsha and Elena Sudakova, who will, with whom we are working on the project at the Pushkin Museum. So it's, you can recognize the name of the cities with all the debris and examples of piles of rubbles of destruction by the Russian bombs. And you have books by, for example, here, by Evgenia Belarusich and her war diary. And this magnificent Valeria Shashenko, who became extremely famous TikTok little videos in the debris of the war. And is place for grief and for displaying also flowers for the as the color of the flags. So it's performative and verbal and meditative, and it will be exhibited in conjunction with the war diary with all women writers who are writing currently on the war in Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. There's an enormous amount to unpick in all of that, absolutely. Fascinating archaeology. Okay, thank you very much, Clarissa.
So, good afternoon. Firstly, I want to thank Cecilia Numani for giving me the chance to take part in this panel, and also thanks to all the fantastic team that's been helping her. So when I was asked to present the reprint of Materialization of Language, which provided a starting point of reflection of one of the time capsules, as we saw Milk of Dreams exhibition, I asked myself several questions. To partially answer these, and I had to make some further research. So what I'm sharing with you today are some initial findings, which I hope will mobilize the conversation later on. So my three questions today will be, when were feminist debates firstly acknowledged by the Biennale? How feminism was handled? And thirdly, what has been the heritage of materialization of language within the Biennale itself? The catalogue starts with this statement. It's not there. Okay, doesn't matter. I'll read it, quote. This exhibition recounts the present stage of an investigation which has been conducted over the last 7 years, gradually widening its horizons on the relationship between women and language. End quote. Why 7 years? The artist Mirella Bentivoglio started being also a mediator in promoting female verbal-visual research in 1971, almost when Italian feminism emerged. And she was entrusted with creating the exhibition Esposizione Internazionale di Operatrici Visuali, which can be translated as International Exhibition of Female Visual Operators, in Milan. In that show were present many of the artists of Materialization of the Language, as Paul Klee, Biljana Tomic, Giovanna Sandri, Betty Rending, and many others, we don't have time to go through. So in 1978, it was 7 years since she was involved in the intellectual adventure of presenting a series of voluntary ghettoization exhibitions that were able, as she explained, responding to criticism, to collate results of a long-time artistic research process. But what about the Biennale? That same year, the president Ripa Di Meana stated that, in 1978, that feminism debates were present at the Biennale since 1974, a point that triggered my curiosity. After the student protest and the charter reform in 1973, the Biennale was living a moment of institutional renewal and gave space almost immediately to feminist debate, a fact that slipped from the art historians' attention because these were not visual art exhibitions. Here's this right slide. I'm going to name a few of these events. The first was the mise-en-scène of a show, La Donna Perfetta, The Perfect Woman, by Dacia Marini, a theater show that she organized together with the collective La Maddalena in Rome. The plot was constructed around the question, what it meant to be a perfect woman, and the booklet included also some reflection about the feminist movement. Actually, there's more about this than about the show itself in the booklet. The other event was Donne e Cinema, Women in Cinema, which was an only women film screening program, and that was a little bit the diktat from other festivals, other feminist festivals that wanted only women artists, directors, or subjects to be screened in these film screening programs. And here you see some of the films that were shown. Siamo tante, siamo donne, siamo stufe. We're many, we're women, and we had enough, which was a documentary by Lotta Feminista, or Vanda by Barbara Löden, and many others, or Le Bonheur by Agnes Varda. So after this initial interest, which seemed promising, we cannot find any other examples, though. Issues about redefining the exhibition format and boosting international legitimization were more pressing for the Biennale team. It was in the framework of the Dissent program in 1977 that the Venice Biennale endeavored to present other thinking intellectuals and dissent art from behind the Iron Curtain. So in the extremely dense program of the Dissent Biennale, we can recognize the presence of some feminist voices. For example, there was a lecture by Lia Lecci about women dissent in German literature. Okay, I don't know why they are missing some slides. Anyway. There was also other participation of Mirella Bentivoglio, Federica Di Castro, to the visual art meeting titled Avant-Garde and Neo-Avant-Garde in East Europe. We now get to 1978, so not much has happened, and this is a troubled, difficult political moment for Italian history, but also a turning point in the feminist movement. As Marco Scotini states, it was a catalyst year detonator. Not only the Biennale exhibition, there were the Biennale exhibitions that you see here, which were two, the feminist exhibition. One was Materialization of Language, and the other one was Spazio Aperto. We're going to talk about both of them. We also had a retrospective of Katy La Rocca. But that year, we also had the publishing of the text published by Carla Lonzi, Shut Up or Rather Speak, or it was also the year of the collective experience of Beata Angelico, or there was also the feminist convention in Belgrade, Comrade Woman. So it was really a very dense year. And within the feminist movement, it was also a moment of ruptures. Some of the feminists were convinced that it was important to occupy relevant positions. And this is why we had all those processes that also Thomas Bingo was talking about. With this idea, the Gruppo Femminista Immagine di Varese approached directly the president, Ripa Di Meana, with a proposal for an exhibition. The result of that request went beyond their expectations. Not only Ripa Di Meana allowed them to organize the exhibition, but because the room of the Magazzini was larger than they expected, this allowed them to invite also another feminist group from Naples called Gruppo Donne e Creatività. In that same venue, a month later, took place the exhibition Materialization of Language. Okay, this is the wrong slide, but you can see, just so you can see it, you can see Mirella Bentivoglio speaking at the Biennale of Dissent in 1977. Here you have Materialization of Language in 1978. The exhibition, as we know, encompassed many women artists. There are only few images of the exhibition, but there was a large exhibition devoted to reconstructing it and talking about it in Milan in 2019. And what I want to underline here about the catalog especially, it was very interesting how Mirella Bentivoglio wanted to promote women artists not only through the exhibition, but through the catalog. The artist biographies, which usually are at the end or are very short, take in this catalog the center stage. Basically, it's a catalog of biographies of artists. So we have the stories of these artists and some images. Bentivoglio's abilities in being a mediator are pivotal to the whole destiny of Materialization of Language. She distinguished for her curatorial involvement with feminism and organized more than 30 exhibitions of nearly only women, trying to reverse the percentage of exhibitions of only men. Also, she brought the exhibition to New York the following year in 1979, but with a different title, From Page to Space. However, after 1978, if we look at the heritage of this exhibition, the percentage of women artists didn't change much, and Binga today told us exactly confirmed this. We need to wait the 1993 Venice Biennale to see a significant rise of women artists, and or an attention also to the role of female artists and art critics, curators, and artists. And these were exemplified, for example, by the homage to Carla Lonzi, here we are, to Carla Lonzi, or a section devoted to Carol Rama, or a collective titled Riavvicinamenti, which was part of Aperto 93. Other examples, for example, was the award of the Best Italian Pavilion, Best Pavilion given to Italy in 1999. That year, Harald Zeman nominated 5 female artists, Luisa Lambri, Grazia Toderi, Monica Bonvicini, Bruna Esposito, and Paola Pivi, to represent virtually their country's pavilion. However, there are very other few examples, but I'm not going through those ones. However, if we get stuck into the percentage, which are nevertheless relevant, as we've been talking since before, we will miss an important point, which looks like a clue, a trace of microhistory a la Carlo Ginzburg, we can say. On the second edition of Bentivoglio's catalog, the one that was reprinted, it was added that the venue where the show took place was called Spazio Aperto, open space. Spazio Aperto was the title of the feminist exhibition that preceded this one. And the title was not chosen by the artist, but by the Biennale. Mariuccia Seckel, which was part of the feminist group that organized this exhibition, states clearly in her autobiography and confirmed it also through an interview because I couldn't believe it, so I wanted to be sure. But why then? The title meant to indicate a space of the Biennale devoted to politics, feminism, a space open to the issues of contemporaneity. The word aperto, which means open at the Biennale, was used before that time, before 1978, to define multiplicity, divergent approaches, or things that could be simply hardly be described otherwise. For example, there was a seminario aperto, which was devoted to new media, or documentazione aperto, which was a section of the Italian Pavilion in 1976, involved in documenting intersections between politics and urbanism. Basically, a loose interpretation of Umberto Eco's open work concept that allowed the Biennale to welcome experimentation and artistic research, which didn't fit the canon. When the following edition of the Biennale in 1980, it was decided to organize Aperto 80, Open 80, curated by Harald Zeman and Achille Bonito-Oliva. Regardless, we now tend to remember that exhibition for the success of painting and the Trans-Avant-Garde group. The original idea was that the exhibition would be open to artist production in any sense. Then after 1982, the Aperto exhibition canonized in the section of young artists which had no special interest in female practice. The autobiography of Rose Garrett tells us clearly how women artists, she was an artist of Aperto 84, for example, even when managed to be chosen to be represented in an exhibition, had difficulties in working and looking for they were looking for basic human respect. In 2019, Marisha Lewandowska, who worked both with the V&A and the Biennale Archives, questioned in It's About Time the whole idea of art history writing, making the voices of women art historians, feminists, heard and pointing to the fictionality of remembering, forgiving, and rewriting. History has legs, it moves, and the contribution of the exhibition, like Materialization of Language, was to open new routes that we are now today crossing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clarissa. And can we get Andrea back as well to join our conversation? That would be great. Will she be coming back? Yes, yes. Great. Okay, oh, there we are. Hello. Wonderful to see you. Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that was an absolutely fascinating journey through so many different ways of exhibiting women, examining what women are, perhaps, as well, which is inconclusive in many ways, and looking at exhibitions, as all of you in many ways have made clear, that exhibitions are simply part of a larger conversation. They're not the end in themselves, that the world isn't perfect. Exhibitions can't change the world, but they can really stimulate discussion. They can stimulate visibility. And it's a kind of archaeology, I think, that all of you are doing. And Andrea, I'd like to ask you, considering this debate that we're having right now is around the idea of what is the role or the importance of women's exhibitions. You said that you differentiated between women and feminist agendas. And I'd like to hear from you what the distinction is.
Well, I think that concerning the state of the war and the state of debates on feminism, we can't base anymore the idea that feminist programs has to do just with women, because even we can say that many women doesn't fix in feminist program. Then for me it was a great experience when curated the Biennale in Mercosur to consider men artists, hetero artists that have a feminist program and some series of work. For example, Gonzalo Elvira, an artist that was developing a feminist program, a feminist project on Bauhaus women, very much connected with one basic feminist program in art that is to recover figures of the past that has been forget. Then this is the difference. Another important point for me is not just being a woman artist means that you are a feminist artist. And this demands positioning yourself, recognizing yourself as a feminist. I want to differentiate the perspective of artist, the perspective that the work involves, and the vision that the curator or the art historian has towards the work, interpreting from a feminist point of view. I think that we are in a moment of the debate when we need to make a lot of differentiations in order to be able to represent the complexity of the moment. We are not in the 60s, we are not in the 30s, we are in 2022, and feminism has a complex history, and we need to create ways to differentiate different positions, not to create values, but to be able to understand positions, complexities, programs, and towards a nuance analysis of the present.
Absolutely. You know, it makes me think of Shakespeare's famous line about the past is prologue. And I guess it's very important not to impose necessarily 21st century values or feminist values, which in themselves are very disparate, on historical moments as well. Adrian, in terms of your examination of women in, say, the 20s and 30s, obviously it was a very volatile political time, and many of the artists who you refer to come to politics from very different positions. So how do you, in a sense, explore that historical moment from a 21st century perspective? What is your angle on that?
My angle is the anticipation. It's very important. Valentine de Saint-Point, in her manifesto of the futurist woman, didn't just picture the woman as a futurist person, but she was thinking about the cycle of the civilization, that some period of the civilization are completely flat and with no nerve, and some others pushed with war, have more activities, and the same thing happens with, for example, rights and oppression in many countries. So there should be negative forces through which women have their specific way of responding, and I'm always interested in the magnificent history of women replies, which is totally different from male replies in the same avant-garde movement or even today. And it's the reason why I forged this idea of feminine mythologies, which goes back to Hecuba, to Antigone, and to these figures which are timeless. They were not just feminists in the meaning of the 60s or 70s. They are thinking about inequity, about ethics, and this is eternal.
Yeah. I think that's very interesting in terms of what it raises about questions around, say, museums being safe spaces, which is a very current discussion now that often rubs up against the idea of dissent or difficulty or artists from the past not necessarily fitting into what our 21st century sensibility might demand. And so what are your thoughts, Clarissa, on the idea of museums being safe spaces or not, or having difficult conversations or conversations that make people feel comfortable? How do you negotiate that?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's extremely necessary, and
what is necessary?
To open conversation even when they're difficult, because the history of the Biennale, for example, not sort of picking up on this opportunity they had, they really tried to understand how to incorporate a discourse which basically they didn't understand very well. They didn't know really what to do with it, how to work with it, which category put it. So, and in this attempt, in the end, they dropped the opportunity. So the courage to keep open even things that are difficult is really, I think, something that should be done. Maybe sometimes failing. I mean, yeah. And the problem is that usually museums are involved with legitimization. And this idea that of trying not to fail in what they exhibit is, I understand, it's a problem. For example, when someone comes up and say they have a forgery or something that's fake, or and they didn't know. I mean, it's part of the whole process of understanding and getting to grips with art creation, which is basically made by humans, so we all do mistakes. So I guess have the courage to stay in front of what modelize, what can construct, and sometimes you have to pull down things to do something new. So I believe in this opportunity.
Humans are very messy creatures, aren't they? And history is a very messy place as well. So it's something that we all have to grapple with, I guess. Andrea, in terms of the politics of unearthing maybe stories that have been excluded from art historical narratives in Latin and South America. Are you particularly looking for women or women identifying people who fit a certain political narrative, or are you interested in expressions of being alive from all angles of the political spectrum?
Well, of course, my conception is that every work of art has a political inscription. And I want to briefly explain what I mean with that. Every time that the work of art disrupts normalized discourses, it's a redistribution of meaning. Every act of redistribution of meaning, it's a political intervention because it changed the order of things. And of course, on the other side, you have some artists that are more politically committed, even committed in, close to political organizations, and are making an art political that could be an art for denouncing, for resisting oppression, dictatorships. Latin America has a long history of an art, connected with this kind of interest. Even an art that looks to be connected with unions, that it looks to be connected with students and with different political struggles that are not necessarily that the ones that involve directly artists. And we need also to make all these differentiations. Even so, I don't think that just is political an art that is evidently political, whose content is evidently political. Every art has a political dimension. I don't know if it is something else that was in the questions before. If I think that art should be connected, or feminism should be connected with other political agendas, and I think that yes, we can probably talk about later, but doesn't mean that feminist art, feminism is directly involved with, or should be, from my conception, involved with another political agendas. But probably we can talk more later about that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can talk about that now, because I think that's a very strong point, that the idea of just having an exhibition of women artists without looking at the intersections of politics, race, class, all of the things that produce art and create meaning in culture would be rather meaningless, or rather simplistic. So, and I think that also pushes against the idea of, the common question that people are asked around the idea of women-only exhibitions is the one about ghettoizing women, that we're putting them in a ghetto and that they're not in part of the main narrative because we've put them over there, sorry, this is a very long-winded question, but I'd love to hear from all of you, in a way, about what you think about this idea of ghettoizing or not, and how intersected the displaying of women by artists should be, with all of these other big questions around class, the structure of meaning, politics? Maybe you can just answer as you like. Yeah.
I don't know. I was curious I'll answer what, because it was a point that Mirella Bentivoglio pointed out, and she was responding. That was one of the criticisms that she had to respond to. And she firmly believed that is something that should be done. Because if you don't sort of isolate, in a way, in a sort of collective way, and sort of join forces together and show exactly how the force and the potentials of these artists, they would sort of disperse. So, and she believed also in what Andrea was saying before, so it made me remember a lot of the repetition. So so there was the same artist trying to put them together, sort of trying to make, and that's exactly what curators did in the past. I think they still do, but I'm an art historian, so I tend to look at the past. But what curators do when they want to promote a group of artists, they simply in a way, but anyway, they sort of repeat the exhibition. They sort of try to put them in different contexts, but it's sort of the same group of people that they are taking around them, letting them know. So I don't see that there is any different strategy, as Andrea was saying, in using this ghetto way. Pink ghetto, that's what they were called, right? Pink ghettos in the 70s, they called them.
Yeah. I mean, it's
as a strategy,
yeah.
I think is good.
Yeah.
Then obviously, we hope there's no need at a certain stage, I would say.
I mean, it's ironic, isn't it? We were talking before about, you know, men for centuries had exhibitions around male art, but it was never called a ghetto. It was never called, you know, a marginalizing of male art, you know, but for some reason, it's something that comes up again and again.
We shouldn't look at the labels, right?
Yes, no, yeah. Adrian, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm quite comfortable because in all my exhibitions, the presence of male is always a stimulation for women. They have more power, of course, but they create a condition of challenging women, and women are replying with a much stronger response. And Marinetti is always present in my exhibitions, Rudolf von Laban, who was the teacher of Mary Bigman. And in the contemporary world, of course, I don't feel that I'm ghettoizing anything, because the two genders and even transgenders and mid-genders are comfortably in my exhibitions, because the subject groups people together beyond borders.
Yeah. I mean, Andrea, as you mentioned, you know, straight up in your presentation that you were, it was very important for you not to look at the idea of woman as an essentializing or a biological category. And I think that what is really powerful about all the different exhibitions you've all been talking about is that in each of these exhibitions, no two women are alike. I mean, so even though they're classified under the idea of women's exhibitions, they reiterate that every woman is her own person and has a different relationship to the world. Could you talk a little bit more about that idea of pushing against essentialism, which essentially is how women were defined in the past?
Well, when with Cecilia Fajardo we were curating Radical Women, of course we were observed for many of our colleagues that we were constructing a ghetto. I thought, well, when it's an exhibition of German art, nobody talk about the ghetto, or when it's an exhibition of British art, nobody talk about the ghetto. But when it's an exhibition of women art, then the ghetto word appears. Then for me, this is just funny to observe how illustrated people can use different ways of understanding issues. But at the same time, what we discovered, and particularly after selecting the artists and studying them profoundly, is that in any way they were representing strict essentialist perspectives. They were classified by women And at that time, I used the category of administrative classification, because the state, the health institutions are always asking you about your sex. And usually it's a binary division. In Argentina, lately this changed through the law, and then you can inscribe in official forms more and more according you identify yourself. But this is not the common case. The state has in its hands classify us. That's why I use the concept of an administrative classification. But these women artists, administrative classified as women, they were representing diverse sensibilities. Some of them were lesbians, many of them were questioning the place that society used to understand maternity, and showing very different points of view that were in a way fragmenting this essentialized body. And of course, this is a strategy you use, or I use, for making radical women, but strategies are changing because you need to change things. You can't use always the same strategy. Then I think that in other moments, all of us as curators, we use differentiate strategies, and we let apart these solo women exhibitions. Then should we still made or not? Yes, but also depends of how you are articulating your desire to change the world of art, to make it more democratic and able to represent difference.
Absolutely, and given the pace of change, I mean, Clarissa, you were talking about how women only started to become more visible really in the 90s, in the 1990s in the Venice Biennale, which is, I mean, that's 25 years ago, you know, it's really recent. So how useful is the art historical canon still? The traditional one that people would talk, say, about the development of formalism, or how the Renaissance was taught, or perspective, like 1,000,001 things that people were taught in classical fine art degrees, that some of which are still taught. How useful are those paradigms?
Well, oh God, this is a difficult question, but I don't know how useful they are, to be honest, but I understand that when we talk about things, about art, and about, we need nomenclature, so we need ways to say something about what we're looking at. So what I found extremely interesting, and it's sort of the core of what I do, is try to understand how this nomenclature is created from an institutional level. So that's why I've been working so much on the Biennale, and try to understand how this legitimation is built, and also the sideways, what happened on the margins of this history. So I think that we need, obviously, ways to do narratives, build narratives. We need to do that. However, always in a critical way. I mean, what has been there? Why should we say it didn't exist? But maybe we need to look also what was out of focus at the time, or try to understand exactly what it meant, at least. That's what I try to do at lessons, sort of differentiate. This is what we say, this is who said it, and why it was said that way. And then we have also other narratives that we need to talk about. So I think that important role of the art historians is try to look sideways a little bit. Sometimes it's more fun.
That art history is a work in progress. That it's
it's a shape-shifting thing. Absolutely.
And it has to be allowed to shape-shift, because
I think none of us can teach the same course you taught 10 years before or something like that. It's impossible.
Yes.
So you keep on changing. I think, I don't know, what other...
I mean, it's interesting in terms of how criteria has changed, in like how taste and style and judgment is in flux, in a way. I mean, what's your relationship to the canon, Adrian?
Dissident. I'm a perfect dissident, and I refuse. And it's like the manifesto of global refusal. What I'm interested in is to read the text and the manuscripts of the artists I'm interested in, even if they are extremely rare, and try to define the way in which they were defining themselves. And I don't apply any psychological or anthropological grid on anything. And also I never coach any contemporary critique nor contemporary analysis. It's a very direct relationship with the primary material. And I discovered that if the truth can exist, or is a kind of sincerity somewhere, it's much better to just erase all the grids of art history, all the frameworks for lectures. And it's the reason why in all my exhibition, I follow the artists from the beginning to the end. I see the variation of their trajectory, some paradigm shifts, some awareness of new subjects, and all these things are informing me rather than writing a critical text within the frameworks or academic writing, etc.
I'm curious about what first prompted you to start sort of unearthing this work, because it's so specific and it's so fascinating, and there are a lot of artists you talk about who I have never heard about, and I'm really interested in that period, and so it's extraordinary, the research you've done. What was the first sort of step in that direction?
Yes, I was a curator of contemporary, new media, contemporary architecture, philosophy, and my first exhibition was Fugitive Fluctuations in '95, and it was about anticipation of future mutations. And at this period, climate change didn't exist, but I defined this notion of climatic uncertainties. COVID didn't exist, but my issue was the encounter, the collision between different set of living, such as the world of the virus, but at this period we had AIDS, HIV. So it was all about anticipation, and at this period I was also had interviews and talks with Paul Virilio. We wrote together, we published together issues of cyberculture, of the future of virtual urbanity, the way in which virtual communities will function with factors of disaggregation of the real cities and factors of aggregation of virtual cities, which are gathering through Zoom now, and so it's all is about anticipation. And what I'm interested in is that many of the artists I'm interested in anticipated, but they are totally erased from the art history. And what I'm doing is to link as much as I can the history which goes back to 1,000 years ago up to now, and see the continuity of the human resistance. And it's not about only politics, it's just something which is not really defined, it's just something you can't avoid. And Antigone is the representation of this refusal of the iniquity of the king who wanted to force her not to see the death to bury her father. So it's just one injustice is just symbol of something, but and there is also the pleasure of collecting, and I lend as much as I can to institutions. For Danse sa vie it was 50 pieces, for Futurism a huge quantity of pieces, but and some pieces I never lend because they are too emblematic of my own feminine future, so you can't. I don't want to multiply, and I cultivate rarity, scarcity. It's the opposite of Andy Warhol. You know, if you see in the same Biennale or exhibition the same artist over and over again, the power vanishes. And so I don't put anything online. There is no press images. You have to come to the exhibition and see the beauty of the artworks. And in some of the sessions we have this issue of Walter Benjamin, the aura, that the photo has no aura, but all my photographs have a magical aura because they are unique. The Soichi tsunami photos you have seen, He was a Japanese photographer during the war in America. He was deported. He burned all his archives because he was afraid. And he had just 2 years of magnificent encounter with women artists, Martha Graham, Mary Bini Montgomery, Charlotte Rudolph, the photographer of German Expressionism. All her atelier and studio was destroyed under the bombardment of the Allies in Dresden. Everything is precious, and the chemical variation is magnificent. These women and male, sometimes photographer, experimented magnificent chemical reactions and paper. So the aura of each piece and the blind stamp and the manuscript handwriting creates a magic that I want to preserve with rarity. And the publications are a good place for exhibiting thoughts and linking images together, what you can't do necessarily in an exhibition place where rooms are separated.
Well, wonderful, amazing work, yeah. As we're sort of getting to the end of our discussion, I'd sort of like to ask you all a sort of speculative question about what still needs to change. I mean, in recent years, obviously, and wonderfully, the idea that art history is a history of exclusion has really been challenged and explored, and more exhibitions are unearthing things that have for far too long been hidden. But what still needs to change? Andrea, what would you say to that?
Well, I think that we need to continue moving on. Because the world is changing, then there are always things to change. There are new exclusions. We are able to see exclusions according we are working with the first time visible exclusions. Then to think about art as a territory of few selected works is to impoverish very much what art means. That means multiplicity, means the possibility to approach to new concepts, sensibilities. Art is probably the only unregulated language or space of creation we have. Art doesn't need to prove anything. In order to be able to imagine the futures in general, we need the territory of art. If you are reducing this territory to a few standardized and canonized names, we are reducing the extremely great possibility that art has to be a territory to think alternatives to this present that in the way it is not promising probably any future. Then art is one of the territories we extremely need in this present. And we need that it's a rich concept of art.
Absolutely, absolutely. Clarissa, what do you think needs to change?
Well, I was many things, but one thing that I find very challenging, and it will be, I think, the challenge for art historians in the future for sure, is the way exhibitions now rewrite art history. And it has been going for a long time, so it's not just something that happened today, but the consciousness now that curators have of contemporary art when setting an exhibition and thinking of history, there's much more awareness. So, and this also means that they are more dangerous in a way. I remember a presentation, actually 2 presentations made by Oki Enwadzor, and where he did them in 2 different times, so there were 4 years between one and the other, and they made the same question to him. So if exhibitions were writing art history or not. And the first answer at the conference, I remember it because it's my topic, so I really remember that answer, and he said no. absolutely not. Our contemporary, absolutely not. It's not about art history. And the second time, he already did the Venice Biennale in that case. And he said, yes, absolutely. So it made me think, so, I mean, he was an incredible man, very talented. So what made him change, I mean, mind so much? And I thought that when he got to work, probably, after years and years probably, he saw actually that you can't just do something and think that hasn't to do with history. So I think this awareness that has been growing will be one of the challenges for art historians, because you need to untangle and distinguish what's going on. So it's, yeah. So yes, I would say this will be one of the challenges from my point of view.
Adrian, what do you think needs to change?
I think it's just so beautiful to have, to commission two brilliant curators, curators like Cecilia and Umani, who can initiate new ideas, open new perspectives under your opening magnificent perspectives in Latin America. And I've had the chance of working and being invited by Christine Massel, who was also director of the Venice Biennale, but initiated Danser sa vie and Women and Abstraction. I was also invited by Massimiliano Gioni, who was interested in Valentine de Saint-Point. I think curators have a power, art historians have a power, and I hope that politicians or institutions can just commission brilliant people and brilliant actors of the culture, and just leave them alone and let them open new perspectives.
That's a good point to stop on, I think. So I think we've reached the end of our session now. It's been such an honor and a privilege to speak with Andrea, Adrian, and Clarissa. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
Thank you very much to the Venice Biennale for this very generous invitation, and to the brilliant team, and to Cecilia Alemani for her amazing show. So thank you very much. Thank you.